The Cannabis Conversation. A European perspective on the emerging legal cannabis industry.
Welcome to the Cannabis Conversation with Anuj Desai, where we explore the new legal cannabis industry by speaking to the professionals that are helping to shape it. So today is my 50th episode. I'm really very pleased, very proud of having got here. It's been a really fun ride. Genuinely the first time I've ever done a project with having no outcome in mind at all. I just thought I'd roll the dice and see what happened. So to get to 250 episodes is a real sense of achievement. It's been scary to begin with, but amazingly fulfilling. I've met loads of interesting people, some of whom I'm happy to say are friends of mine now. The industry at the moment is going through some quite challenging times. Money has dried up a bit after a tough 2019 in Canada in particular, but that's sort of filtering through to the rest of the world. Some people are saying that the bubble has burst, which might be the case, but I look forward to the second wave being built on firmer foundations. Here in the UK, the Food Standards Agency finally made a move on CBD, long overdue, which is great to see. I guess we're yet to see the full implications, but hopefully it will improve the standard all around, which is much needed for CBD to really gain credibility and mass appeal, although the trend is very positive in that direction. So in terms of me, I've decided to stick around and aim for 100 episodes. So I hope you stick around too and help me get there. But for now, on with the show. Enjoy. And on my show, I have Gavin Sathianathan, who is the CEO of Alta Flora and has a number of other roles within the cannabis space. Gavin is a special guest because he is responsible for getting me into this industry. A few years ago, I saw a BBC4 documentary by Professor Green on TV where he was talking about all aspects of weed. And at the end, there was an example of a cannabis entrepreneur, and that entrepreneur was Gavin. And I said, I know that guy. So I texted him, we went out for coffee, and the rest is history. Welcome, Gavin.
Thank you. Yeah, I've forgotten about that.
Yeah. How's it going?
Very good, thank you, yeah.
Good. Well, thank you for being my special guest today. You know, loads of stuff we can talk about, and you've got a brilliant background in this space, so lots to get into, but maybe you can help by just sort of starting off with where you came from and how you got into the space.
My background? Yeah, I was trained as a chemical engineer and then became a management consultant out of university. I went off to the US to do an MBA and then came back to London to work in the tech industry. So I actually worked in media initially at a company called Endemol that made TV shows like Big Brother and Deal or No Deal and other daytime TV shows, let's say. And I was working on the digital side, so everything to do with the web and mobile at the time. From there, I moved to Facebook. So I was one of the relatively early guys in Europe. So pre-IPO, working with Europe's venture capital ecosystem, early stage companies, helping them figure out how to grow on the back of Facebook. And then we IPO'd, and I changed role and was much more focused on large advertisers and helping them figure out how to move their budgets out of TV and print media and into Facebook. One of my clients was Tesco. We were doing some really interesting stuff with club card data and Facebook data, and at a certain point in time, it made sense for me to sort of move from the Facebook side to the Tesco side. So I moved and joined Tesco in 2013 to focus on digital media and data and exploiting the internet in new ways for them. And I think it's fair to say that I didn't really fit in the corporate environment, and around 2015 was looking at entrepreneurial opportunities. And at the time I had a team of developers and was very interested in crypto, and we were looking at Bitcoin, and I decided that world was too complicated for me. I wasn't smart enough to figure it out.
Is anyone
Indeed. But then by chance, one of my old professors from where, when I'd been studying in the US, started writing about cannabis in Colorado. So in the autumn of 2014 I started looking at what was happening in the US, and it's fair to say it's interesting. You know, it's like a whole new world, and I guess I've been interested in cannabis, but it's a very different culture in the US, much more sophisticated. So I ended up leaving my job at Tesco. I quit. I went with my wife and 2 kids to Boulder, Colorado. We put our place up in London on Airbnb and decided to move to Boulder. So I spent the summer of 2015 in Boulder looking at the cannabis industry, and it blew me away, because I guess you see regular Americans buying mainstream branded products in offline retail stores, the dispensary, And it's a very different model to what we have, in Europe, where we don't have a cannabis industry. And so from there, I decided to sort of jump in. And that was 5 years ago. My first business was in the US. I made some investments in California. I ran a dispensary in Las Vegas. We took it from the medical market in 2015 into the recreational adult use market in 2016. Decided to exit the US business for a number of different reasons, but primarily due to Donald Trump and Jeff Sessions and a shift in sentiment in the US around the likelihood of federal legalization under the Republicans. And moved back to Europe. At the back end of 2016, in the EU Parliament, we had the first session on medical cannabis, and my dispensary was shown as an example of the sort of legal, regulated supply chain in the US. And from there, I started looking at businesses in Europe. It was sort of fortuitous that at the time I came back from the US, Germany was starting to open up. We were starting to see some movement in the UK. And so from there, I've been running a number of different businesses. I co-founded a business called Oxford Cannabinoid Technologies with a classmate of mine from business school called Neil Mahapatra. That business is now fairly well established and is doing research around the much more traditional paradigm of pharmaceutical drug development.
And that is what, synthetic kind of?
Yeah, so that's a combination of plant-derived cannabinoids for rare and orphan diseases, and then it's synthetic cannabinoids for some of the larger indications. And we can come on to the IP landscape and why we look at it in that way. And then in 2018, kicked off the business I now run, which is Alta Flora. And we are focused on the evidence base. So I guess we can talk about the challenges with European cannabis, but we believe that cannabis has a unique role to play in improving a patient's quality of life, but we need to build the evidence base and the data set to make that clear to the medical establishment, for whom cannabis is new, is somewhat scary in some ways, is an unknown because they don't have the relevant evidence base that they're used to seeing. And so we want to work with the regulators and with the medical establishment to try and fix those problems using technology. And then I guess finally I have two board positions. I sit on the board of Product Earth, which is the UK's longest running sort of cannabis, CBD, hemp trade show, which runs up at the National Agricultural Exhibition Centre every August. It's a very exciting business. And then finally I sit on the board of a company called Grass & Co., which is a botanical wellness business, creating CBD-focused products.
Great.
That's
so you're pretty busy.
yeah, exactly.
Cool. Loads of stuff to dig into there. Just off the bat, I think one of the things that you mentioned was the sort of level of sophistication in North America. Mm-hmm. Do you mind elaborating on that? Because obviously that's more of a consumer market, or on the face of it.
Yeah.
Where do you see the sophistication? Is it just as in they're just further ahead?
Yeah, they are. Look, I have this line that people who know me will hear me say incessantly: cannabis is on a journey from drug to medicine to lifestyle. And on the western coast of the US, all the way down from Alaska to Mexico, you can buy cannabis in dispensaries, right? Adult use cannabis is legal. On the eastern seaboard, it's on a journey from medicine to lifestyle. So we have medical states like Florida, we have states that have opened up adult use like Massachusetts. There's a debate around when New York will go, but it's likely in the next couple of years or so. In Europe, we're on this journey from drug to medicine. And so when I look at the US market, I look at how people talk about cannabis, the language they use, the lexicon that's been developed, frankly, the understanding of the plant, of the different technologies to grow the plant, the different strains, the different ways of consuming the plant, and they're just ahead of the curve.
Yeah.
And look, the power of the internet means that we can see on YouTube and Instagram what they're doing, but it's not the same as understanding the role that cannabis plays in US culture.
Yeah.
I often talk about the US Billboard 100. 80% of the US Billboard 100 references cannabis. We see it in mainstream US culture. There are patients with medical cards on Modern Family.
I talk about it in a similar way actually, because the amount of cultural references in obviously most of the world consumes a lot of American media, and there's just I remember Back to the Future, there's a casual reference to a reefer in that, and obviously when I was a kid I didn't know what that was, but to have a casual reference in effectively a kid's movie is indicative, whereas in Europe, I'm not sure what the difference in terms of how many people smoke, but or take cannabis in various forms. but it's just not talked about at all in the same way.
Yeah,
so
absolutely, yeah. No, it's cultural, absolutely, and there's just more openness to have the conversation in the US.
Yeah.
And so, look, it's a far more sophisticated market. For sure.
If we go back to Alta Flora and some of the stuff that you're doing with which I guess is your main business, the patient data bit. Do you want to talk a bit more about that? Because you're working with drug science, I understand.
Yeah. So there's a few things underpinning why I think that the way that we look at cannabis as a medicine requires us to think quite differently about the process of developing drugs, bringing drugs to market, assessing the efficacy of drugs, looking at the cost effectiveness of the drugs. Cannabis is a complex polypharmacological substance. It isn't one thing. It's many molecules in a I've heard it described as a treasure chest, but it's complex, and the sort of single molecule, single target way that Western medicine has traditionally thought about drug development is not fit for purpose for cannabis. The other thing is we all have a very, very individual reaction to cannabis, and so I talk about it as the genesis of personalised medicine. So in what world is the randomised controlled trial appropriate for a personalised medicine? I don't want my random drugs, I want my personalised drugs. And so to do that requires you to have an interaction with the patient at the individual level. Some of my experience from Facebook is I think relevant. At Facebook, we used to talk about mass-produced 20th century media, so the newspaper being produced with content for everybody, right? It's the same content, whether you or I read the same newspaper, it's the same stuff. Our Facebook news feeds are fundamentally different. They're personalized newspapers, right? It's our one-to-one interaction with all the stories that are out there. And I think the same shift is happening in the pharmaceutical industry, that the era of 20th century mass-produced medicines is going to come to an end, and we're going to have to think about how do we instrument the interaction between a patient and his or her individual medication to understand what's really going on. And so what we've done at Alta Flora is to build an app to allow a patient to log their interactions, their consumption of cannabis as a medicine. And that in itself, I think, is going to, hopefully allow us to build a somewhat unique data set, because, whatever numbers you believe, whether it's the 1.4 million from YouGov or the 5 million from Maru, look, cannabis consumption is happening at scale in the UK, and it is not understood. Not understood at all. So what we're trying to do is put all that sort of metadata around the consumption experience, the where, the when, the what, the how, the dose, the potency, the route of administration, and understand.
Strain? Yeah,
absolutely. Strain is a bit of a misnomer, I think. Well, look, there's a couple of different ways you can get your cannabis in the UK, right? One is pharmaceutical cannabis from a doctor on prescription. And that typically is Bedrocan here, and that's quite well characterised, right? So we know what the composition is. If you are, as we're trying to do, instrument the black market consumption as well, then strain is a little bit, hit and miss, right? We don't quite know. But even in the black market, I would still like to know, it would still be useful data to understand that, the consumption experience, even if we don't know what the patient's consuming, knowing why they're consuming, when, how, where, why. Those are all interesting facets of the consumption experience. And so, look, broadly speaking, I want to instrument consumption, through the prescription channel and through the non-prescription channel. Let's understand how people are consuming, what's going on. And that'll give us a level of insight, I think, into, the products that we need to create. The second data set that we then want to build on the back of this consumption data is the effect that the consumption has on quality of life for patients. And I make the argument around quality of life because of the statement I made at the top of the show. We believe cannabis has a unique role to play in improving the quality of life of patients. And we're fortunate to have well-defined frameworks to assess quality of life, which are well understood by the regulators, by NICE, by the MHRA. And so I have this line, I think, part of the failure of the cannabis industry over the last, let's say, 5 years has been that we have not tried to learn the language of the medical establishment. I think it's fair to say that the medical establishment has not tried to learn the language of the cannabis community, but really it's incumbent upon us as people who want to
change people's minds.
Who want to make change happen, to learn how to speak the same language. And so the language of quality of life and quality scores is something that regulators understand. And so 2021, which is the largest global study of medical cannabis in a sort of real world setting was set up by the charity Drug Science. And Alta Flora is a sort of founding industry partner, and we'll be using our app to collect, to instrument this interaction between the patient and the medicine, and then to try and determine what impact that has on a patient's quality of life.
Fantastic. Yeah, we often talk about it on the show in terms of this new paradigm that's needed in order to a new paradigm for evaluating medicines.
Yeah.
Because cannabis struggles to fit into that.
Yeah.
Randomized, controlled.
I think, yeah. And look, I don't think there's a single silver bullet here. I talk about a jigsaw, right? And I think lots of companies and academic institutions are going to be putting pieces on the table, and we somehow have to build the picture up together. And look, I hope that our app is one piece of the puzzle. And I think what we are likely to be good at, given my background and the kind of people I know, is in building the apps and handling the data and trying to do some interesting analysis around it.
Yeah, and I mean, what really jumps out there is there scope for international collaboration on this? Because obviously, Israel's got a big amount of patient data, which has been for 20 years or so. California as well, various other places.
Absolutely.
Pooling this data and trying to kind of, as you say, put the pieces of the jigsaw together.
So look, absolutely. I think there's an emerging European reform mechanism, which is for countries to set up large-scale national trials. So the French have set up their trial, the Danish have their trial that's ongoing. We've got Drug Science here. Around Europe, I think there's a notion of let's put a trial in place, have a government or a national body of some sort oversee that trial. And then what I would like to do, as you say, is sort of harmonise a data collection framework here, where all of the regulatory bodies can get comfort around the way that we're collecting the data, analysing the data, deriving insights from the data, and then hopefully, actionable recommendations, so we can get patients access, because they're not getting it at the moment.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, I mean, look, everyone will be really supportive of getting more data, and I think the personalisation bit is really, really exciting.
Yeah, absolutely. Personalisation is interesting. I think
do you think that's quite a challenge for traditional pharmaceutical businesses, because they look to sort of isolate something and replicate it on massive scale? It's quite hard to do that if it's, if I need to make several different products, you don't have the economies of scale.
Yeah, I think it's partly around sort of the manufacturing capability. I think the more challenging piece is that it's very difficult, I think, if you are built as a B2B business, which most pharma companies are, to then develop a B2C relationship with your end patient. And so, look, some of the ways I describe what we're trying to do at Alta Flora is to build a 21st century pharmaceutical business. And if you were starting from scratch, from the ground up, then I think you'd start with a relationship with the end patient and gathering data from the end patient, because then you can start to understand, how to personalise the medicine. And I don't think it's beyond the wit of some of these pharma companies to figure this out, though. They are hiring technology people, data people to figure this stuff out.
And they understand regulation well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. They have established relationships, and but I think there is something to be said for culturally starting with, well, actually, let's put the patient at the heart of what we're trying to do.
Yeah.
And that's what we do.
Yeah, I mean, I've had a few sort of previous guests on, Greg Orzorn, who's talking about this idea of a lot of medicine is focused on treating the symptom rather than the underlying cause. And there is a promising signs that cannabis, through the endocannabinoid system, can do that homeostasis bit of maybe treating the root cause. Yeah,
absolutely. It's a really exciting area of medicine, but it requires lots of data, lots of instrumentation, probably some regulatory shifts, so we can bring these drugs to market. But
and given your kind of experience, a lot longer experience than a lot of people in this space, and also across a number of different sort of verticals, how have you found your sort of business ideas have evolved over the time? Have you pivoted, as every good entrepreneur has done?
Oh yeah, I think it's impossible not to. There's been a few interesting things, I guess. The paradigm of North America initially was around the license, and there's a fascinating chart of the value of the license depending on when you got it, right? And so the first license in Canada was worth a lot of money, and then it sort of tails off. And so there is this notion of first mover advantage around licenses, and I think we in Europe caught a little bit of that fever in like 2016, 17, 18, as some of the markets were opening up. And some of the North Americans came over to Europe, bringing this notion of the license being valuable. And I think what we've seen...
Is that kind of oil and gas kind of
it's a little bit of
legacy?
the natural resources mentality, right? Mining and absolutely, because of where the roots of the Canadian industry lie, especially on the public market, the publicly listed LPs. But Europe is different. I think ultimately this is regulated as a pharmaceutical industry is regulated here, whereas in the US it's regulated much more like the alcohol or tobacco industry. So it's seen as a vice over there, and it's seen as a medicine over here. Drug to medicine to lifestyle again, right? And so I think Europe just will be different to North America in terms of how we conceive of our industry. And so as we've realised that the European industry is going to be slightly different, I've pivoted my operations away from thinking about licenses or the notion of putting together teams with paperwork to go and establish an operation. And in this industry, which is in constant flux, we've spent a lot of time thinking about, well, what are the sort of enduring, sustainable sources of value? And one of them is data, which is why we're focused on building an app that captures this unique data set around consumption and the impact on quality of life. I think the other exciting thing about the data, especially given my background, I guess, at Facebook and Tesco, is figuring out how you can bring in data from other places. And we know that your body processes cannabinoids very differently depending on what you've eaten, how much you've slept, how much you've exercised, how stressed you are, where you are, all these sorts of things. I think go into this sort of data piece, which I think is where we've really ended up. Other pivots we've made. Look, a couple of years ago we were quite keen on large scale cultivation. Now I think there are other people who are far better capitalised than we are, who actually want to invest in those sorts of assets, and that's not something that we want to do. With that being said, I've got access to some interesting genetics, and I think in the spirit of looking at data, actually genetics is a form of data for us. That's the way we think about characterising the plant. And so we're looking, in that early piece of the value chain, less on the asset-heavy cultivation experience, but breeding, cloning.
So R&D.
All of the R&D, and you think about the sort of data flow from plant genotype to chemotype and phenotype, and then ultimately to some sort of formulated medicine. I can almost imagine a database of formulated medicines, right? And we want to then tie that database of formulated medicines to some database of human biomarkers, and then to our app to try and figure out, given a specific combination of cannabinoids, flavonoids, terpenes, or other phytochemicals, how does that profile of chemicals interact with a particular person that looks like this, and what's the impact on their condition and their quality of life. And so those are the sorts of data sets that we want to build, and I think genetics is interesting. I talked about formulations. I think formulations are going to be an area of enduring value. There are some questions I think around IP and defensibility there, but patients have to have formulated medicines, and it might evolve to be more like the generics market than the traditional patent cliff pharmaceutical market, but
And with formulations, are you talking about mixing cannabis ingredients or cannabinoids with non-cannabinoid ingredients, other herbal?
No, absolutely. I think there will be. People often talk about cannabis as a ingredient in traditional Chinese medicine or Ayurvedic medicine, and the notion of compounding and putting various different plants together is fundamental to what they do. So I think there's definitely scope for that in what we see with cannabis over time. For sure.
Yeah, cool. I think you touched on it as well in terms of Europe being different to North America. So do you see difference in fundamental characteristics, or is it just we're further behind on the time horizon, if you like? No,
they're fundamentally different.
And what sort of things do you think that...
So look, I mean, right now the US cannabis industry is I call it a cottage industry. It is given it's not regulated by the federal government, I think it makes it very difficult to argue that you can look at the US as a model that you want to export to the rest of the world. And culturally, given the acceptance of cannabis over there, we've moved beyond it being seen as just a medicine. It's definitely a lifestyle product. But look, I talk about the regulatory framework being different. Firstly, national here versus state there. I think the inspiration for a lot of the regulatory models comes from the alcohol and tobacco industry over there. It comes from the pharmaceutical industry over here. Start with cultivation. Over in North America, it tends to be much more fashion driven. It's fad driven. You go to the Jungle Boys dispensary in LA and you can get all the different flavors. I think European growers almost get more kudos from having stabilized a plant, and so it's a different type of attitude when it comes to cultivation and growing plants.
I think on a really basic level, I always think people, in order to kind of legitimize and overcome stigma, are very much like, this is definitely a medicine. They get very serious about cannabis because they don't want to be seen as a stoner and all the bad sort of stereotypes. Whereas because culturally it's different in the US and they're further ahead, they're just more embracing about the whole,
absolutely,
the whole piece.
So I think the notion of cultivation is different. Look, their market is far more advanced, and so when it comes to manufactured products and the quality of the product in North America is light years ahead of where we are in Europe. Distribution is very different. Cannabis is distributed through dispensaries. In North America, the notion of a bud tender being equivalent to a bartender is very interesting. Whereas in Europe, it's pharmaceutical distribution. And then what is also interesting, I guess, is around consumption. We're seeing the first consumption lounges in North America. For me, I think you can only really build compelling recreational brands, adult use brands, when you have consumption venues. We've seen this from the alcohol industry. Brands are built in the on-trade is the way they talk about it. So brands are built in bars and in pubs and in clubs. And until we get those consumption venues in the cannabis industry, I think it's really hard to associate a brand with a feeling. And so...
But that's we'll talk about time horizon as well in a minute, but I guess that's when we're closer to recreational being on the horizon now, or you?
Yeah, I guess it depends what the form of recreational is. So, like recreational, where you can go to a shop and buy a cannabis product and go home and consume it, is the equivalent of the off trade. It's the equivalent of going into a supermarket or a cash and carry or a off license and buying a bottle of beer or whatever, buying alcohol. I think we have to, in Europe, we'll get there. Obviously, we'll get there eventually. And we'll have our own types of consumption experiences. And you'll have brands built around those consumption experiences.
Yeah. Underpinned by the social experience, really, isn't it?
Yeah.
I remember when I first came with you to Cannabis Europa in 2018, everyone there was talking about medical going online within 2 years, and then it happened in 6 months.
Exactly.
What's your current view on, are we still 5-10 years away?
From rec?
Yeah. Impossible to predict.
No, it is impossible to predict. No, of course it is. But in the context of divergence, looking for a new industry, some sort of growth driver in the UK, we can see the data in North America about how quickly this thing's growing and how many jobs it's creating and what it's doing to economies around the US. And it would not surprise me if the Conservative government looks at this in 6-12 months time and starts to say, well, actually an adult use market in the UK would be something that we can look at.
And I agreed. And obviously Blair Gibbs has gone over, who was formerly with the Centre for Medicinal Cannabis, is in Boris's team. So obviously a sympathetic ear there.
Absolutely, yeah. No, I think that there are going to be a handful of folks in relatively senior levels of the Tory party who are looking at this. And as I say, the key difference now relative to 4 or 5 years ago is we have data, we have evidence from those states in the US where they have legalised. So we can see the impact on whatever factors you want to consider, whether it's road accidents or teenage incidents of cannabis use or whatever the case may be. By the way, we can also see the positive impacts of recreational cannabis use in prolonging the productive economic life of older people as they can work, using cannabis. It is in moving people off of harmful drugs and onto plant-based products, etc., etc. So I think we can have a much more data-driven conversation about it. We've just got to be brave enough to drop some of the prejudices that we have about cannabis.
Definitely. Do you think there also, both Canada and California haven't been terribly successful with the way that they've attempted to regulate. Do you think the government was probably waiting, or is waiting, to see an effective model in working in the real world, and then maybe nick that one?
The cannabis industry continues to grow. It may not be reflected in the public market performance of companies in Canada or in California, but I think the underlying dynamics of this market continue to be positive, Have they been heavy-handed in how they thought about the regulations? Yeah. California's probably overtaxed. Canada probably didn't move quickly enough on things like retail distribution. Are there lessons to be learned? Yeah, absolutely. But there were always going to be bumps in the road. Anytime you're bringing in sort of industry out of the shadows and trying to scale both supply and demand in an uncertain market with the almost unknowable impact of how durable the legacy market is, which has performed a perfectly coherent role for decades now. We're in the foothills here.
Yeah. And actually, a keener appreciation of how to deal with that legacy, black market, and learn the mistakes from Canada and California would be useful.
Yeah, I mean, look, the other point is, I guess, that Canada and California legalized in '96 for medical purposes, so they've effectively had a sort of functioning grey, pseudo-legal market for over 20 years. There is no grey market in Europe. Our cannabis market, I say the £6 billion cannabis market in the UK is in the grow shops and the head shops up and down the country. And as you move to a legal cannabis market, there isn't a pool of people who've been in this grey space in between that you can migrate across. So the human capital challenge actually is huge in Europe. And figuring out how we educate people at scale is going to be one of the big challenges for the next few years.
Yeah. Interesting times ahead. Well, that segues quite well into what are the exciting areas, other than things that you're doing, that you're seeing from the space, or maybe even exciting territories where they're doing stuff?
There's loads that's exciting, isn't there? There's
pick a couple.
Yeah, there's tons that's exciting. So a few off the top of my head. Let's start by saying the fact that the EMA have licensed a cannabinoid medicine in Epidiolex is a good thing. It is a good thing. Because we have legitimacy now in the eyes of the medical establishment.
And that's the European Medical Agency.
So this is GW Pharma's Epidiolex medicine for kids with epilepsy. Now, there are lots of families who would like access to other types of medicine for epilepsy. So I think the context here is still that there are huge problems around patient access, but it's moving in the right direction. So that has to be a good thing. The shift in sentiment is probably the most interesting for me, and it's been the most marked, I guess. When I first came back from the US in 2015, I was having conversations with investors where they would ask me if it was moral or ethical, my business, if it was moral or ethical, or passing judgment on me as an entrepreneur and someone trying to make things happen. And so it's nice to not have that level of stigma now, to be able to talk about it, without people judging you in quite the same way, or for at least you to be able to justify why you're doing what you're doing. I am extremely excited by some of the scientific research that's going on. Articulating the crystalline structure of the CB1 receptor, I think, is transformational. I think there's a lot of work we can now do in a sort of much more deterministic way to look at how this sort of lock and key mechanism works. I get very excited by the notion of using data at scale to unpick this stuff. On the more sort of adult use side, on the rec side, I think the rise of the Green Party in Germany and the Greens across Europe is going to be a precursor to some big shifts in how we think about decriminalisation of cannabis. That sort of social justice argument, I think, is really going to come through in the next few years.
And that's still, in the US, it's quite a well-documented big problem, but it's still a significant problem.
So the Last Prisoner Project in the US has as its mission to get every single person who's been convicted of a non-violent marijuana offence out of prison. I've been talking to folks about doing something similar here. It also plays into this sort of societal shift. There's a generational shift in how cannabis is being perceived. And, you talk to anyone under the age of 25 and it's a very different story.
Yeah. An area of excitement for me is actually seeing the older generation who are changing their views as well, because I guess, moving towards the end of life and actually realising that I want a better quality of life and this could help me. And
not even end of life, I guess.
I mean, later years.
60.
Yeah.
That's not, in a. I used to talk about cannabis and longevity a lot, because I think as we think about this aging society and people living for longer and the types of conditions, pain, mood, diet, sleep, those conditions which have a deep impact on quality of life as people get older. I think cannabis is made for these people. It really is. Yeah. So look, I think the impact I talked about earlier, the sort of elongation of a productive working life that we're now seeing from people using cannabis into later life, just enhanced quality of life as you get older. Slightly off topic, but I get very excited about what we can do with hemp. There's a lot to do, but the environmental attributes, the positive ecological benefit, I think, is going to become unarguable sooner or later. I'm waiting for hemp to be a signal issue in the 2020 US presidential elections. I think we'll start to see these sorts of issues becoming much more important.
Yeah, definitely. Well, we're a big fan of hemp, and actually, after I was working with you on Product Earth in the last summer, we did a lot of hemp talks, and I was really inspired by just how amazing is a sustainable material it is.
Yeah, absolutely. So big future there. Lots of work to do around the regulatory framework and how we think about hemp and what we can do with hemp, and frankly, driving consumer understanding of the potential for hemp. I feel like there's a load of conversations to be had at the top of UK PLC. It's almost every FTSE 250's board needs to have a perspective on what this is going to do, either for their own operations or for the potential to sequester CO2 out of the air and become a carbon negative business. All of these issues, I think, are going to become really, really interesting over the next few years.
Yeah, and I think with hemp, there's probably a bit of a PR job that's needed, and to get away from firstly the ignorance, but that underpins cannabis in general. But there's probably a bit of a hippy dippy tie-dye type association with hemp where which needs to be readdressed.
No, it does. But look, this plant is going through the biggest rebranding that mankind's ever known, as more use cases emerge, and more businesses are built around harnessing the power of hemp, those historic associations are going to drop away. And look, for people like me and you, I guess we're okay with it being misunderstood, because I guess we've seen what it can do, and it's on us to prove that it can do these things.
What's what makes it all fun. Cool. So thank you. As we move towards the end, my traditional final question is, what did your parents say when you told them that you were getting into cannabis? Professionally, that is.
Well, I guess that's quite an interesting story, because I started looking at cannabis, so 2014, and then didn't tell my parents what I was doing. I was running back and forth from London to Vegas, running the store, and then we were quite fortunate in that when I actually publicly launched the business, we had a small article in the Sunday Times in May 2016, and so I didn't actually tell my parents. I just gave them a copy of the paper and said, "Can you read this?" And I think they were shocked. Had some explaining to do since then, but
and were they kind of worried, or
how can I put it? I've worried my parents for 30 years about cannabis, so were they worried? I guess in a way they viewed it then as someone leaving a relatively successful traditional career and going into the world of drugs, which to them, as sort of home counties Daily Mail readers, was like, what are you doing, But not only my parents, a lot of colleagues, ex-colleagues, former colleagues, people in my network didn't understand at the time, But they're cool with it now.
Yeah, good. It's a journey, isn't it? It's a journey. I like that. That's a different answer. Being able to, give someone in the Sunday Times and say, read this is a good way to break the news to them.
Exactly.
Cool. Well, thank you, Gavin. That's been brilliant, and thank you also for helping to introduce me to this wonderful, crazy world.
Pleasure. Glad you're in it.
Yes.
Glad you're enjoying it. Yeah.
Cool. Thanks, mate.
Okay.